Good evening. We're going to begin in just a minute, so now is a great time to remind you to silence your cell phones. And please find a seat. Welcome to the Israel Forum. I'm Rabbi Ayelet Cohen, director of the David H. Sonnabend Center for Israel and the Center for Jewish Living here at JCC Manhattan. The Israel Forum was created with the intention of creating a civil and productive environment within the Jewish community in which to engage on real and challenging issues around Israel. The JCC is truly a community center, a place where our robustly diverse Jewish communities come together. It is not our goal to achieve consensus on difficult issues. It would be a mistake to do so. But it is our responsibility to facilitate conversation because we are ultimately in community together. So here at the Israel Forum, we strive to create an intimate environment where you'll also have the opportunity to engage with one another. We are inviting you here into our living room to share food and drink and to learn and to talk with each other. We'll actually pause the program partway through so that you can talk with your table mates about what you've heard so far before sharing your questions with the panelists. A few words of thanks. The Israel Forum is made possible by a generous gift from the Wexler family. We are so grateful to Donna Wexler-Linden and Larry Linden for envisioning and supporting this program, and to the Lambert, Sonnabend, and Fredericks families whose support created the David H. Sonnabend Center for Israel. I also want to acknowledge the work of our incredible staff team, our AV, maintenance, facilities, and security staff, and especially Nadia Khan, without whose work tonight's program could not be possible. I'd like also to take a moment to welcome our live stream viewers and to encourage you to submit your questions via the live stream chat function during the Q&A. I'm now happy to introduce our guests. Todd Gitlin is the author of 15 books, including Occupy Nation, The Roots, the Spirit, and the Promise of Occupy Wall Street, as well as many other works on media in recent America, 3 novels, including The Sacrifice, which won the Harold Ribelow Prize, and a book of poetry. A graduate of New York City Public Schools, Professor Gitlin holds degrees from Harvard in mathematics, University of Michigan in political science, and the University of California, Berkeley in sociology. A political activist in the New Left of the 1960s, he's now an underachiever. It's kind of sad, but what are you going to do? He's now a professor of journalism and sociology and chair of the Ph.D. program in communications at Columbia University and honorary professor at Ben-Gurion University of the Negev. He contributes to many newspapers and magazines, lectures frequently in the U.S. and abroad, and is a member of the editorial board of Dissent, and is online regularly at Tablet, dissentmagazine.org, and tomdispatch.com. Professor Gerald Steinberg is professor of political studies at Bar Ilan University in Israel and president of NGO Monitor, a Jerusalem-based research institute. His research areas include Middle East diplomacy and security, the politics of human rights and non-governmental organizations, Israeli politics, and arms control. Steinberg is a member of the Israel Council on Foreign Affairs, contributes to the Institute for Counterterrorism, the Mideast Research Group of the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs, and is an advisor to Israeli governmental bodies in the Knesset. His recent publications include NGOs, Human Rights and Political Warfare in the Arab-Israeli Conflict, the UN, the ICJ, and the Separation Barrier, War by Other Means, Best Practices for Human Rights and Humanitarian NGO Fact-Finding, and Filling in the Blanks, Documenting Missing Dimensions in the UN and NGO Investigations of the Gaza Conflict. In 2013, Professor Steinberg and NGO Monitor were awarded the Menachem Begin Prize. And our moderator tonight is Deborah Lipstadt, Dorot Professor of Modern Jewish History and Holocaust Studies, the Tom Institute for Jewish Studies, and the Department of Religion at Emory University. A leading authority on the Holocaust and anti-Semitism, Lipstadt is the author of several books, including the Eichmann Trial and National Jewish Book Award winner History on Trial, My Day in Court with a Holocaust Denier, which is going to be made into a movie soon. We are eagerly anticipating. Lipstadt was a historical consultant to the United States Holocaust Museum, was appointed by President Clinton to the United States Holocaust Memorial Council, and served as a member of the U.S. State Department Advisory Committee on Religious Freedom Abroad. She received her BA from City College of New York and her master's and PhD from Brandeis University. The Jewish Council for Public Affairs awarded her its highest honor, the Albert D. Chernin Award, given to an American Jew whose work best exemplifies the social justice imperatives of Judaism, Jewish history, and the protection of the Bill of Rights, particularly the First Amendment. She has received honorary doctorates from Ohio Wesleyan, John Jay College of Criminal Justice, Yeshiva University, Bar Ilan University, the Jewish Theological Seminary, and Hebrew Union College. And enjoy.
Thank you. Thank you, Rabbi Cohen. It's a pleasure being here. This is sort of home for me, so I'm really pleased to be here. I'm also pleased because our objective tonight is to learn something, as opposed to tell people what we already know, and to have a fruitful exchange of ideas amongst people, certainly on the panel, but probably sitting around the tables too, who don't necessarily agree with one another. We don't all look at the world the same way, but to at least try to understand where the other is coming from, whether we agree or disagree, but to listen and maybe in our listening to learn, even if we continue to disagree. So what I've done to facilitate that, we're going to skip speeches tonight, and that goes for the questions as well, but that'll come. I've prepared a number of questions for our two panelists, and to ask them so we can sort of get an idea of what this BDS movement is at its heart. Because I think many of us have very different conceptions, not necessarily right or wrong, but we see it in very different ways. And the second piece would be what might be, from their perspective, the most efficacious way of fighting it, challenging it, working with it, harnessing it, whatever verb you want to use. But there's been a certain response in the Jewish community. Is this the best way? Should it have been more? Should it have been less? Should it have been stronger, weaker, or just taken a different route? So I think maybe to begin at the beginning, we begin the Seder Avadim Hayinu with, the most basic, we were slaves, and then we go on for a lot of hours till we eat. I'm already anxious, to ask our two panelists, possibly starting with Professor Gitlin, to define each, and then Professor Steinberg, to define what you think BDS is at its heart, beyond the simple meaning of boycott, divest, and sanction.
Well, I decided to go to the text. So there is a text. You can find it online under bdsmovement.net. And their lead page begins with a discussion of Israel denying Palestinian fundamental rights. And then it says, the campaign for boycotts, divestment, and sanctions, BDS, is shaped by a rights-based approach and highlights the three broad sections of the Palestinian people: the refugees, those under military occupation in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, and Palestinians in Israel. The call urges various forms of boycott against Israel until it meets its obligations under international law by 1, ending its occupation and colonization of all Arab lands occupied in June 1967 and dismantling the wall; 2, recognizing the fundamental rights of the Arab Palestinian citizens of Israel to full equality; and 3, respecting, protecting, and promoting the rights of Palestinian refugees to return to their homes and properties as stipulated in UN Resolution 194. Now, movements and organizations are complicated, and it's never exactly sure what it is that an individual believes, and the question is partly a matter of when you're asking and who's doing the asking and so on. But insofar as there is, and we don't have any, I don't think there's any public information about how this organization makes its decisions or who the decision makers are. But I take it at their face that they object to a whole lot about what Israel has done. In the earlier rendition of this text, the words, until about a year or so ago, the words occupied in June 1967 did not appear. They were added after objections on the part of some to the effect that what it read then, ending its occupation and colonization of all Arab lands and dismantling the wall. That is to say, they did not recognize the Green Line, so somebody told them to clean up their act, and they decided to clean up their act. Although, if you look further on the website, you'll see that there are other documents, I've looked myself, that act as though these words were not added. So the old dispensation is still flourishing there. Who are they really? What do they really say? I know no more than this.
Would you suggest, therefore, are you suggesting that given that this phrase was only added recently, and these are people who supposedly know what they're saying about the situation, that at its heart it might be dismantling Israel?
Well, I think they're clearly, I've debated a BDS a couple of times. I've debated a BDS representative. The last time was last year at the New School, and I put it to him. At that point, the language had not emerged, the new language.
Is this Palestinian you debated?
Yes. And he's a graduate student, I believe. I can't remember his name.
Folks at home.
And I put it to him that there was a sort of deliberate ambiguity here, and that it was said commonly that many of the leadership actually are in favor of the so-called one-state solution. And he said, yes, in fact, he was, but not everybody was. But I don't know in all what my reading about the group, and which is we could spend a whole 24 hours a day keeping up with the BDS movement. But I've yet to hear a spokesperson of BDS say that he or she does not believe in a one-state solution. There's a sort of boilerplate statement that BDS does not have a fixed position on the matter. However, if I can just go on for one more moment, that third clause about UN Resolution 194 is a giveaway, because of all the resolutions one might choose to honor, and there are quite a number of United Nations resolutions, of which I think probably I would say the most important is Resolution 242. They have recourse to this 194, which is from 1947 or 48, and was sort of cooked up in a big hurry in the middle of the war. And it speaks of a refugee, of right of return, so and so. But it's, I mean, I think in general, any fair-minded observer, legal or not, would say it's a very peculiar stone to build your ideological temple on. It's highly selective.
Okay. Professor Steinberg?
Well, some of us hold to the written tradition and others to the oral tradition. And of course, in the oral tradition, we certainly have evidence that predates the written tradition, and I'm going to tell you my predating tradition. Somewhere in the middle of 2001, I was in Canada. I was actually, at that time, I was not doing anything to do with NGOs. I was partly representing Israel in discussions at the International Atomic Energy Agency. I was doing nuclear nonproliferation. I was one of two Israeli academic point people on that. But I was in Canada, and I spoke to a Canadian colleague, and she said to me, very exciting, she just got a new job. She's in charge of human security in the Canadian foreign policy, the foreign ministry. And her first assignment is this wonderful conference they're going to do in Durban to mark the end of apartheid. It was called the UN Conference for the Elimination of Discrimination, Racism, and Other Forms of Xenophobia. They're going to bring in thousands of activists. It's going to happen in Durban, South Africa. And I said, oy vey. I said, this doesn't sound good. This does not sound like something that's been thought through. The preparatory conference was held, each part of the UN, that there are 5 regional areas, UN Human Rights, now it's called Council, and the Asian one was held in Tehran, and that's where they're going to write the actual text. Well, Durban took place in September, early September 2001. There were 5,000 human rights representatives, NGOs, including Human Rights Watch and Amnesty, were there, and they adopted a different text. And I argue that that's the beginning of BDS. Because they took the South African model. Anthony Julius says they took, the British lawyer, you may have some familiarity with him.
My hero.
They took all their trophies and all of their banners and all of their slogans and all of their activism that was so successful in defeating apartheid, and they moved it over to opposing Israel. And the language that they adopted there, if you read the declaration, Israel is the only country that's singled out and named in great length at all. That nothing else is mentioned, everything else is general. And in the 3 sections that deal primarily with Israel. They use the word apartheid about 5 times. Apartheid, ethnic cleansing, genocide, war crimes. Sometimes they come back around. So they're setting up this whole movement using the tools. Boycott, BDS was a central tool in the anti-apartheid movement, and said, we're going to establish this, we're going to apply this to Israel. And the final clause, the operative clause was, they called on the international community to impose a policy of the complete international isolation of Israel as an apartheid state. That was not led primarily by Palestinians, and I think the 2005/2007 website and Omar Barghouti and others, they're the Palestinian face of what is really a post-colonial, very strongly anti-Israel, anti-Zionist. Essentially, I define this as a 1948 agenda, not a 67 agenda. They added the language when people care a little bit about it, so okay, we don't really want to see elimination of Israel, so we're going to add this, but you pointed out the difficulties of that. But I think if you combine those pieces together, this is about demonizing Israel. And no matter how you color it, the process, I was going to say a movement, a campaign, those 5,000 NGO representatives are still among the leaders. If you look at Human Rights Watch, if you look at Ken Roth as the head of Human Rights Watch, he was then, he still is now, and if you look at his Twitter feed, you see the special animosity towards Israel and the push to bring Israel before the International Criminal Court. That's all part of this process. BDS feeds into that. It's not just about boycotting or divestment or sanctions. It's about lawfare. It's about bringing Israelis and Israel to international tribunals, singling out Israel, different from all other countries. And as Erwin Kotler said when he spoke last night, and he says this quite regularly, just as the goal of the apartheid movement was the dismantling of South Africa's apartheid system, the goal of BDS is the dismantling of Israel as a Zionist state. And I think that is the dominant, that's certainly the way I look at it.
Mm-hmm. Let me ask you then, but would you say, and I know you've had both contact with people who support BDS and know quite a lot about them, that one could possibly draw a demarcation between those who wrote these pages and the founders of the movement, whether from Durban or the people you encountered in your discussions and your debate, I think at the New School, Professor Gitlin was referring to earlier, and many of the, certainly on the campus, the people who have signed on in recent years who do so with a certain degree, if we're going to say that the goal of some of the people involved in the founding of BDS, or maybe the people at the heart of it, were the demonization of Israel, the dismantling possibly of Israel, that many of the people who have signed on in recent years might not have that goal. They might think it's simply boycott, divest, sanction. This will change Israel from its policies, certainly on the West Bank.
The short answer is yes. I'll give you a slightly longer. Yes, there are an infinite number of layers. And Todd said, you said something about, is there somebody at the center who runs this movement? I think clearly the answer is no. There are a lot of different movements. And to some degree, they sometimes, like the Jews and everybody else, they fight amongst each other.
Oh, unheard
but
of.
I tend to take towards the chumrah, the more cautious, concerned view that the more radical groups are the ones that are going to dominate, and the other ones are being pulled along and contributing to this, the process. So that, yes, there are many people out there who, I think sincerely, perhaps out of knowledge, perhaps out of not much knowledge, support BDS Light. Product labeling is sometimes called the European policy of product labeling from the West Bank. And the Europeans say that's not BDS, and others, and I am one of those who claims that's BDS Light. It's creeping into that realm. So yes, each faction, each process has its own language, and some of it is strictly aimed at end the occupation, but I think it does feed into that 1948 goal in any case.
The reason I'm pressing this, and maybe Professor Gitlin, you want to weigh in here, is that when you might say to someone who has said, I've become a BDS supporter because I think this is a good way about bringing about a change in Israel's policies, and you say to them, the movement you're supporting is essentially designed to annihilate the state of Israel, to destroy the state of Israel, they look at you like you're from another planet because there's that cross of communication. And I think it has implications. I would suggest it has implications for how we address the issue, because you're talking about two widely different objectives.
Well, it's not unusual that we find people who are historically ignorant. So the notion that
In the
there's
United States?
I know, it's shocking, isn't it? So the notion that 1967 took place 19 years after 1948 is startling. You know, I mean, we're not talking about a tightly organized phalanx of conspiring cahoots keepers. We're talking about a sort of big sloppy sort of thrust. And I think, you know, maybe I'm jumping the gun here, that it behooves us to ask ourselves, as we should ask about all forces that we disapprove of, where are they coming from? And so one answer always to a question like that is, well, there are malevolent figures who want to, say, dismantle the state of Israel. And that's always a partial answer to many questions about who are people active in one or another cause. But that is a very limited approach to how to do work in the world, because you also have to ask why people who do not sign on to the full 19 articles or whatever, to the whole Megillah, feel pulled along, as you said, to subscribe to it without even fussing too much about what's actually in the fine print. So therefore, you know, to jump ahead, I think that opposing BDS is an important thing to do. I've been doing it for years. I'm steadfastly and conspicuously opposed, in particular, to the academic boycott, which is, I think, always a heinous idea. And by the way, you should understand that BDS mostly is repelled in its efforts on campuses. Don't get the idea that it's sweeping through. It has very few successes. A couple of minor academic associations have been swept away, and they are, believe me, minor. So there's a certain sense in which, in order to address what's really going on the campuses in particular, you have to ask why it is that so many people are angry at Israel, including Jews. And this is not because they're being managed by Omar Barghouti or the Durban Squad or whoever. They are really angry about injustice. So you may want to dispute with them about how they understand justice and injustice. But to say that they are simply tools of a sinister conspiracy, I think, is demeaning and also ineffective. You have to think, you have to talk to them about what's on their minds.
Well, you've sort of jumped to the next question, and I'm going to.
Sorry
you
about
have
that.
I know. I shouldn't have given them to you. I shouldn't have shown you. You know, it's like showing the students the exam.
Give me an inch,
before
I'll
the
take a
exam.
mile.
I should have known when I dealt with you. But I'm going to ask you to be more specific, especially since you come from a very important campus, a campus that sort of when people began to look at, for rightly or wrongly so, but almost, I guess, a decade ago, when people began to talk about attacks on Israel on campus, particularly from the academic end, in the classroom, et cetera. Columbia was in people's line of fire, or under the microscope. What's your sense, building on what you said, that it hasn't really swept the campuses? What's your sense of the status of the BDS fight on various campuses?
I'm not even aware there's a resolution pending anywhere at Columbia. I mean, there was a demonstration a few weeks ago. There were some people gathered on low library steps with their version of a wall, and I think they were talking about apartheid and so on. And life went on. I mean, it was no big deal. It was just one of a number of things. I've read about some actually truly horrendous conditions, atmospheres in some American campuses where Jews do feel endangered, where Jews have come under special scrutiny, for example, when their names have been submitted for a membership in student government or something.
The incident
It was
UCLA.
at UCLA, right. So the question, so if you're Jewish, tell us everything you think about, et cetera.
Do you know in UCLA about a year ago, most of you seem to know it in case someone doesn't, a young woman, a sophomore, was proposed for a subcommittee of the governing board of the student government a fairly important subcommittee. And when she came in for her interview, which is generally, as far as I understand it, a pro forma kind of thing, she was asked by the people on the sitting around the table, and there was an academic advisor there too, whether she thought, since she was a Jew, whether she thought she could be fair. And it was taped. The academic advisor at the moment said nothing, and subsequently there was a brouhaha and there was a reversal, and then they all, danced the hora around her and welcomed her in. But it was the initial comment that disturbed so many
So
people.
there are such incidents, and they're heinous, and they have to be fought tooth and nail. I'm not aware of anything at all like that at Columbia. In fact, I spent some time when that outcry emerged. I believe it was in 2004.
So it's 12 years.
I spoke with the students who were protesting. The students, some of whom were featured in the film made by the David Project, if you remember that. I spent some time with.
Unbecoming.
Sorry,
I think it was
Columbia
called
Unbecoming,
Columbia
or Conduct Unbecoming, whatever it was unbecoming. I spoke with them. I am mindful. I was mindful of them. I took them seriously. I also spoke to other people in various positions around the university. In the end, frankly, I was agnostic. I mean, I didn't think these were firing offenses. I think a lot of garbage goes on at various quarters of the university, and that's another subject we could talk about. But I don't think there was anything like a campaign of vilification or diminishment. It's not unsafe to be a Jew. I mean, I read something today. There's a picture of a swastika up on a Brandeis fraternity house. Good God. There's nothing like that going on in Morningside Heights. Nothing. Nothing.
We're going to move beyond just the student government things, but Gerald?
Well,
this is
I'm
Steinberg.
Israeli, so I look at former and very often someone who lectures and goes around from campus to campus. I gave a talk at Berkeley a few months ago, and now I'm at Indiana. I go to various campuses every year. I get a different impression. I also get a lot of emails, and obviously there's self-selection involved. But I see a much more threatening environment for people who identify with Israel. I think there's a lot of activity and money going in to try to the Jewish Voice for Peace organization, which just got a lot of money from the Rockefeller brothers, and their budget went up to $1.5 million from $200,000. They say explicitly their goal is to drive a wedge between Israel and American Jews, particularly on campuses. And I think they're succeeding in doing that in a lot of places. They're creating an environment. The whole controversy taking place in Hillel, and having spoken to a number of directors and heads of Hillel recently about this, about the attempt to maintain a safe space and the efforts to disrupt that safe space for students who, it's not just Jewish, it's also identify with Israel in a positive way. I'll just tell you from my own perspective, for Israeli students, this is in the Israeli press a lot now. A lot, every day you can't, and some of it is overdone. Some of it is, hey, we ignored this I should have said, when I came back after I found out, when I started to look at the whole Durban process, and I said, I'm going to take a year off, and I'm going to write about this. That was in 2002. But the Israeli government, everybody said, it's shmum, it's not important, we all the time, nothing's different. That's no longer the way it's seen. And when I have students and I hear about we have piles of from students, from faculty members, where the boycott is very, very visible. The double standards, it goes back to demonizing Israel, delegitimizing Israel. Members of committees that will not participate because you're Israel. You're an apartheid state, you're an occupying state, all sorts of other aspects. And a student who goes to do an advanced degree in a college in the UK, and the first thing the professor says to him is, you're an Israeli, that you serve in the, what do they call it, the Israel Occupation Forces, the IOF. Since I was in the IDF, and he said, get out of my classroom, you're a war criminal. And I know that one student I know, and there are probably many, many more. And that's I think that's part of the atmosphere. This vilification and this automatic vilification, the lack of even an interest in trying to understand the Israeli perspective, I think that's growing. I think it's frightening. It's growing among faculty. It's growing in professional associations. I don't think they're all trivial. I think some of them, it's the American Anthropological Association
That's under vote now.
It was passed by the whatever the executive committee.
Yeah.
And as of 24 hours ago, people who are part of that association said to me that right now they're 700 votes behind.
We'll see.
So, well, but I don't want to wait to see. I think it's important that we anticipate
academic
this.
freedom.
And the freedom also to oppose this.
Of course.
And to
I
be
oppose it.
To be
what's so
horrible?
horrible?
I'm not disagreeing with you.
I
think
it's a silly
I'm putting up
academic
a flag.
association having a stupid discussion. So
I
what
think
else?
that's where we disagree.
Well,
Because
the
I think the
question
consequences
is, no, I think
are
that
more significant.
these academic, in the past 2 years, these academic associations, which generally are an excuse for former graduate students to go and see their friends and I shouldn't say that, they're important, I go to them, but have gotten more scrutiny than they ever have before, and more people suddenly know that there is an American Anthropological Association. Yet, Todd, wouldn't you be at least willing to say that there is a drip phenomenon, starts with the American Studies Association, then the American Anthropological Association, then it starts on a campus where students question whether they want to jointly sponsor an event with Hillel.
No, that's appalling. I mean, and every one of these associations has acted illogically, stupidly, unprofessionally, and inexcusably, in my view. Mm-hmm. I mean, and there's a whole lot of lying going on about what's entailed in the academic boycott. I mean, not to reserve this to the university matter, but it's of some concern to me because I have friends who are Israeli academics. So what the academic boycott people say is, well, we're not saying you can't work with Israeli academics if you are American or English or Canadian or something else. We're saying no institutional cooperation. Well, this is a distinction without a difference,
right.
And you have to be blind not to know it. Israeli academics go to conferences. They get money from their institutions to go. If you follow the letter of the boycott proposal, you must boycott those people. The reason, by the way, I became an honorary professor, I didn't really deserve it, at the Ben-Gurion University, is that I, along with others of my ilk, want to be on record that we are actually faculty members of the State of Israel. So if you want us to appear at an international conference, you have to say that. And if there's anybody there who can't bear to be in the presence of somebody who has an affiliation with an Israeli university, you'll have to do without me. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, which is, that's what I think of the academic boycott. So, I mean, there's a whole lot of dishonesty, and that is awful. It's inexcusable. And there's a whole lot of dishonesty, I think, in the BDS movement in general, including this bait and switch.
Okay, you mean like this statement you showed
Yes,
us?
yes.
Mm-hmm.
However, I still think, just a brief repetition, that you can't really confront what's going on here without addressing the fact that, if you'll excuse a little bit of polemic here, the single person most effective at driving a wedge between American and Israeli Jews is named Benjamin Netanyahu. And if you're not prepared to look at that and take it seriously, you're not in the game.
I guess I have to say something about that, Ryan. I can't let it.
You could say he's right. You could say.
Well, he's right. He's not right, but I'm not going to be in the position. I do not put myself in the position of being a defender or an opponent of Mr. Netanyahu. I will point out two things briefly. First of all, I don't want to get into a whole. I think it would be a waste of time. Invite me back again, and we can talk about Israeli politics. We can talk about occupation in one state and two states and unilateralism and all these other things that are out there now, and the status quo and all the implications. But I think that, first of all, we have a democratic system. And the democratic system has produced Mr. Netanyahu as the head of a coalition by 1 out of 120 votes, 61 to 59. And that's how the process works. And we can agree or disagree on a lot of Netanyahu's policies, but I'm not going to change them, And I don't think you're going to change them. I don't think the BDS movement's going to change them. I don't think the New Israel Fund's going to change them. I don't think J Street's going to change them. What we're doing is we're polarizing the Jewish people through this process.
Well, wait a minute. I think both sides may be.
Yeah, I agree. I'm just saying that by going into this issue, and I find that statement troubling. I think the BDS movement would exist whether Netanyahu was prime minister or Buzia Herzog was prime minister or just about anybody else you can imagine would be. Whether there'd be a visible fake peace process or a real peace process or negotiations or not, none of us know. But these are issues that the reality is that we have to deal with this demonization. We talked a lot about the campuses, but it happens in various other places. I think let's at least bring in the issue of the churches. Mm-hmm. I see on a regular basis, especially when I come here and I talk to people who are involved in ecumenical movements and other things, how difficult it is on these issues to get people to understand the complexities of what we're dealing with in the Middle East. It is the obsession against Israel, which drives, for instance, the Presbyterian. And by the way, you see the same actors. Presbyterian General Assembly, where were they this year? Detroit, I think. When they vote on the divestment resolution, you've got kids from Jewish Voice for Peace out there saying it's okay, it's not anti-Semitic, we're Jews and we agree that you should boycott Israel. Same people that come on campuses and elsewhere. So it's not just about campuses, and it is a much wider and more, to me, it's a more disturbing process than, so trying to just pin it on Israeli political outcomes, as complex as they are, well, we disagree on that.
No, I agree with you that there's a great deal going on off the campus. And I agree with you that Israel is singled out as the maximum perpetrator of human rights abuses, and that this is laughable. It's laughably skewed. And that Israel has become a whipping boy or girl or person for a whole lot of purposes, some of which I think are defensible, and many, if not most of which I think are indefensible and are disqualifying of intellectual seriousness. That said, Israel has a real problem here with its international legitimacy. It's not concocted by the Durban people. It's not concocted by Omar Barghouti and his friends or by Jewish Voice for Peace. There is a widespread anguish about what is seen by many American Jews. In fact, I think polls would show most American Jews today, and certainly a very large majority of those who are under 30, seen as a departure on the part of the Jewish state under its leadership, which is, as you say, elected, but is nonetheless the leadership, a departure from Jewish values as we in the diaspora understand them, and that I grew up believing were the heart of Jewishness. There is a rupture, and it was not created by bad-mouthers or by dishonest reporters or by the BBC or anybody else in particular. It's certainly not being created by malevolent NGOs. It is a product.
Do you really want to go there? I'm not sure you
want
to go
there. Oh, I really
there.
do. I really do. You're talking about some of my friends. I mean, what you said about Ken Roth is ridiculous. Frankly, I read his feeds. I mean, I'm a Twitter follower. He's always up in the arm. He's always up in arms about Morocco, about Libya, about Syria, about Iraq. I mean, the man is. I mean, I admire him greatly for his kishkas. Sort of staring at all the abominations in the world and denouncing them.
I'm just going to add one fact here. Not far from here lives a man named Robert Bernstein. Robert Bernstein is now 93 or 94 years old. Look him up in the New York Times. Robert Bernstein came back from the Soviet Union back in the 1970s and founded Helsinki Watch. He built Human Rights Watch. He hired Ken Roth. Two things. Number one, in that New York Times op-ed piece, which I was involved in, he said, this is not the organization that I created. They have lost their moral compass. They have become the leading process in turning Israel into a pariah state. That was published in 2009, and I strongly urge you to read
I've read
that.
it. I have read it.
Okay, and the second point is that with in this range of, if you look, and I studied and I've published in detail on Human Rights Watch and Ken Roth, the number of attacks against Israel and the language that he uses against Israel. In the Lebanon war, when we had, at the very beginning, 8 soldiers were killed, 8 Israelis were killed, 2 Israeli bodies were kidnapped, and Ken Roth wrote something about how this is an ancient, when Israel responded militarily, this was an ancient, it's an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, and an ancient practice, something like that. I think that is the absolute definition of the abuse and destruction of human rights, is an obsession with Israel. I'm not a psychologist, but other people have written about his father and other things. The man has been running an organization that has done tremendous damage to human rights for about 20 years.
You're a closer student of the
Okay,
Twitter over of Ken Roth.
But I also be referring to what Robert
but
Bernstein, the
I have
founder,
enormous
said
respect
about
for
his
Bob
organization.
Bernstein, but
Okay.
he's also one guy,
Okay.
and there are many people in the
I
world
don't
of
want
human
to
rights
turn
with
this
many
into a
views.
debate about Human Rights Watch, but what I would ask...
But it's symptomatic,
yes,
by the way.
Well, let me ask one question of you, Todd. And I think you've alluded to this earlier, but you would agree that amongst many of these human rights groups, many of a broad spectrum, there is what appears to be an unnatural obsession, out of sync obsession with the wrongs of Israel, to the exclusion of the wrongs, or to the a diminution of wrongs of other.
Honestly, I don't know. I don't follow the NGO world enough to say. I will say that there is an unseemly and I think often disgraceful prejudice on the left against the state of Israel. I don't have any qualms.
Okay,
with
let me
saying that.
one more question, and then we're going to open it up. We're going to give you a little have you talk amongst yourselves. For those who remember Saturday Night Live, the church lady, and then we'll open it up to questions. And so I would, on a practical matter, what do each of you see as the most efficacious way of combating, and I'm going to use BDS just as a general, the BDS, and as you pointed out, sometimes it's not BDS, it's other issues that sort of become, BDS becomes the watchword for them. But the serious attacks, particularly on the campus, but not only, but particularly on the campus, on Israel, on Israel's legitimacy. What if you were, if the elders of Zion came into this room from their meeting out there, and they said to you, "Okay, you didn't know that."
Maybe we're here. I don't know.
I always thought you were part of this.
Well, I am. I got a dispensation. I let them meet on their own tonight, so I could make sure we have a good discussion here. But they said to you, "What's the best way of turning things around?" Setting aside Israel's policies, because there many people would say Israel should change its policies, and that would change everything. But what would you say? We'll start with you, and then.
By the way, Deborah, I'm not one to say that if Israel would change its policies, that would wipe out the BDS movement. I think it would crucially contain it. I think it would reduce it to the sectarian margin that it really deeply is. But I'm an empiricist. Sort of let's change the policy and let's see what happens. I don't think you'll see the beating of the drums against the state of Israel. But I'm for discourse. I'm for conversation. I think that I'm against all refusals of conversation. I'm against Hillel's fear of letting people whose views they disagree with dispute with them. I'm against the BDS refusal to, or affiliated groups who refuse. I was told, at least by a Jewish student at Columbia who came to see me about this a while ago, that they refuse to participate in discussions with Zionists. I mean, that to me is reprehensible. It has no business. That kind of talk is inimical to the university. It just has no place. But but I'm for discussions. And by the way, this maybe this will shock you or maybe not. I think a person on an American campus has a right to be anti-Zionist. Because this is America, and we believe in disputes. And the existence of the state of Israel, as much as I defend it, is not written into the Constitution of the United States of America. People have a right to talk about that, but they should talk about it as adults. They should talk about it knowledgeably. They should be challenged where they're flying high from evidence and history. But there is no better approach to what is, after all, a movement that's just riddled with self-contradiction and as well as evident malevolence. There's no better approach to it than to do what we do at universities, which is to argue.
Okay, Gerald?
Tough question. There's a lot more, and I'm not going to talk about all the different perspectives on this. I think using the language and the frameworks, I'm focusing primarily on the young left, the young Jew, particularly, let's start with the Jewish left. To me, that's the biggest pain, that there are so many students on campus who are alienated from Israel. Not those who are critical of Israel but are engaged, that's fine. It's the ones who have gone well beyond that. And on the other hand, there are also ones who are, there is the fear, there is this atmosphere. So part of it, I think, my approach is that we should try as a community to find ways, and I'm talking in a very broad sense, where there are long differences. I was working, and it did not reach fruition yet, to come up with a declaration, which is, we call it red, right, and blue. I'm not sure what it is, but right, left, center, that would involve people who are identified with New Israel Fund and other organizations on the left, Zionist left, Zionist right. What are the things which we agree upon? And how to fight this kind of political warfare? Some sort of a manifesto. I think that finding that common ground, it's going to be difficult, but it needs to be done. Frankly, I don't see people who are leading that, and that bothers me. We see so much diversion and people building up their own constituencies and their own bases, and not nearly enough of that's one of the things that I think this community here might be able to contribute to. I see the people leading BDS, the fringe groups that are no longer fringe. And when I talk about Jewish, yes, you have the right to be anti-Zionist. The question is whether you have not so much the right, but whether it should be somehow pointed out that when these organizations have so much, they become privileged. When they have so much money that they can dominate a conversation, there's no marketplace of ideas when they dominate the conversation. When you can have an SJP and a BDS and a JVP and an event on a campus once a week, and that's one of the, I'm at a conference now on some of these issues at the, in Bloomington, the University of Indiana. There's 70 people out there talking about their own experiences on this issue, and some talk about on their campus. There's an event once a week. And the Hillel group, the pro-Israel students, whatever it is, can maybe get an event together 2 or 3 times a year. The amount of money to me is important. That's something I've been doing for a long time. There's a huge amount of money in this. It's well developed, well invested. And when you have groups that can go campus to campus, church to church, and present this anti-Zionist position. Look, I'll go further. Today, Lisa Goldman, who is an NGO activist funded by the Rockefeller brothers, among others, wrote a piece in the New York Times web edition. It was an absurd piece, but she got the visibility. The headline was, anti-Zionists thrive in Israel, why shouldn't they thrive in the United States? Which is nonsense from so many perspectives. Israelis...
Writers don't write the headlines.
Right.
Gerald.
But that was also the content of the article.
Well, that's a different story.
It was absolutely the content of the article. That it was that anti-Zionists should be not just tolerated, but given platforms on American campuses and elsewhere because they thrive in Israel. Anti-Zionism in Israel is the most minimal of fringe positions. They don't thrive, and Lisa Goldman didn't thrive in Israel. She had no audience, so she left. And many of them are like that. So this idea, it's not about free speech. That's my point. It's about privileged speech, dafka, for the anti-Zionists, which I consider to be racist. It denies the right of the Jewish people. Racists have the right to free speech, but let's call them racists. And I think the Board of Regents of the University of California did absolutely the right thing. That wasn't an attempt to prevent free speech. It was calling it exactly, saying it as it is. When you deny the right of the Jewish people to national sovereignty, it's not about disagreeing on policies. It's about the Jewish people don't have the rights, the same thing as apartheid. Don't have the anti-Zionism, we don't have the right to. That goes well beyond the sort of discussions we have about 67 and boundaries and occupation and settlements. that to
And
me needs
people
to be
have a
taken
right
on.
to oppose
Yes,
it.
they have a right to oppose it, but we also have the right to point out that those positions are privileged and whether that money is provided in a way where there is property. All those issues can be looked
You
at.
know,
and I think
Gerald,
examined.
there is an irony to what you're saying in terms of the money and the privilege, because if you ask many of the people on the other side, they would say those Jews, they have access to the Board of Trustees. I'm not saying right or wrong, but I'm just saying that
The Jews, that's part of the Zionist conspiracy.
well, no,
right?
no, because
Yeah,
if you look at the
control
Board
the
of
media.
Trustees passing resolutions condemning this, that they, that the college administration, university administration responds so strongly that
All right,
the
that
Board
maybe
of
have to be
Regents,
part of that
and
discussion.
from their perspective, it's look who's privileged. You know?
Okay, and then you
I
go
just
back
wanna
to look
point
at all
out-
these Saudi-funded Middle East programs and other things. So, but I think that can be part of the discussion. So the bottom line for me is, number one, trying to define areas where we can work together despite differences on policies. We've lost this concept of the Zionist framework that Israel has the right to exist as a Jewish state, and we need to support that concept. That's painful for me. I grew up in America in a very Zionist framework, and there was no question in the Jewish community I grew up in San Francisco that this was a Zionist community. And now, when I go to campuses and I see the 20, 21, 22-year-olds, and a lot of them say, well, why should there be an Israel? Why should there be a Jewish state? And it's a racist state. And all these other things are out there, and I think that's part of the demonization. So uniting on areas where we can, and it's beginning to happen, but I don't think strongly enough or widely enough. And as I said, I also think
Deborah,
dealing
can
with
I
that resource issue.
piggyback a comment?
Yeah, briefly, because we want
Before
to
we
get
go to
them
the
done.
table. So the subject of money has come up. So I don't see how to have a sober conversation about the place of money in supporting the politics, one way or the other, of Israel, without having a conversation about Mr. Adelson, who owns the cheerleading newspaper, which is the, let's say, a very helpful propaganda organ for the Netanyahu government. I don't see any way to have a serious discussion about the role of American money without talking about Dr. Moskowitz, the bingo king, whose enterprises, whose buildings in East Jerusalem and on the West Bank are helping to turn the West Bank into an Israeli colony. I don't see. This is not government money, so it doesn't concern you. This is private money, but you know, Mr. Moskowitz's money and Mr. Adelson get tax deductions for contributing to activities which contravene American policy.
Todd, when Bob Bernstein
Don't
said,
tell me Bob Bernstein.
let me
tell me
finish.
Sheldon Adelson.
We're not going to have a dialogue if you don't listen, so let me just have the
I
counter
listened.
to your point.
Okay, go ahead.
When Bob Bernstein wrote his piece in the New York Times and said, I've had it with this organization, and Ken Roth and all those other people who are out there abusing Israel for their own, he pulled out, and most of the Jewish donors that helped found Human Rights Watch pulled out. Mr. George Soros came in and gave them $100 million. It's interesting, and I think...
Why do you think he did that? You think he hates Israel?
Okay, hold it.
I'm just saying that
All
you
right.
have Adelson, and then you have Soros, and you have... That's part of the
Soros
process,
is
but
not
it's not
violating American policy
stop,
in doing so.
Stop. You know, some speakers begin an evening with a joke. I'm going to end it with end this part with a joke. So there's a synagogue, old synagogue, which there'd been one rabbi for many, many years, and a new rabbi comes, and there was a debate in the synagogue about people had forgotten, do we stand, I don't know whether it was for Aleinu, do we sit for Ein Eloheinu, Shema, with Shema? Okay. See, there are even different versions of the joke, so you know you're amongst Jews. So they go to the people are fighting with each other. They said, we're going to go to the old rabbi. He knows, he remembers. And they go to the old rabbi. He's very old, and he doesn't quite remember. And they say, Rabbi, do we stand for this? He says, I don't remember. They said, but Rabbi, do we stand for... I don't remember. And the two groups begin yelling at each other. And as they're yelling, it's getting hotter and hotter. He says, but that I remember. So
That's our tradition.
That's our tradition. And I was very much struck by Gerald's comment, and one of the main messages is that we have to find the areas on which we agree across the spectrum. You know, the book of Isaiah says, which has been interpreted to mean, that's not, I don't think what Isaiah really meant by it, that your destroyers will come from within your own ranks. You know, if the anti-Semites had been smart, they would have left us alone and we would have killed each other. And I only say that in partial jest, we would have really gone at each other. So to find those common discourse. And in that spirit and the spirit of this program, I'm going to propose for you a scenario which the three of us had talked about earlier this evening and ask you to really discuss it amongst yourself. I'd come up with one thing, but over the course of conversation, another suggestion was made, and I think it's more efficacious to use the word we used earlier this evening. And imagine you're on Broadway and you walk past a church which says, BDS meeting tonight, you know, come in and discuss Israel, human rights abuses, etc. And you're with someone else who says, let's go in there and give them a piece of our mind. Let's tell them, let's really shout down this meeting. And the conversation between the two of you ensues, you know, is this really the right strategy to take? Are we giving them oxygen by going and publicly challenging them? Should we ignore it? What's being said, et cetera, et cetera? So you fill out the details of that scenario, but imagine that you're in a position where you've got to figure out what you want to do at that moment. And why don't you take 10, 12 minutes to do that amongst yourselves around the table? Okay?
So do we dance while we're waiting?
We can take a bottle of take a bottle
together.
of wine.
Why not? Hi.
So in about 2 minutes, we're going to come back together. So please take this moment to wrap up your conversations. So I'm going to bring us back together. I'll invite our panelists to return to the front of the room, and I'll invite you to wrap up your conversations. Shh. It's great to see how robust the conversations in the room are. Shh. And what we want to do now is come back together so we have time to hear your questions for the panel. So if I can please have your attention. And we're going to ask you to write your questions on the note cards that are on your tables in the interest of time so we can hear as much as possible from the panelists. So please take a couple of moments to jot your questions down on the cards on your tables, and we will collect them, and then we can pose your questions to the panelists. So please take a moment to do that.
I know, I'm just wondering.
If people would pass their questions up, and some of you have taken note of the sartorial splendor of the socks being worn by Professor Gitlin and me. Gerald, we're gonna have to work on your. I know we're gonna have to work on that.
I didn't get the memo.
Okay. If people pass or turn in their questions, so we. The first question I was given is something that came up at the very end. How do you answer people who say, so why should there be a Jewish state? How do you answer them so that they'll listen or that they'll hear what you're saying? Gerald?
First of all, it is a common question, and it's academics use the term post-colonialism, which includes in it a lot of Western guilt and also opposition to at least nation states in Western countries, and that's very popular, and it's almost a sort of form of the old communist position, the withering of the state, the Marxist position, and I can understand why a young, naive teenager, post-teenager would hold on to that view. Then I bring them back to I always say to them, look, I'm a realist. That's the school in which I was brought up with. I don't think that anybody who's Jewish in the post-Holocaust era can be other than a political realist. You have to have both feet on the ground and distinguish between what you want the world to be like and what it really is. That's the preamble. There are 190 countries in the world. There are 28 countries which in different ways define themselves as Christian. We just in Switzerland a little while ago. And there's so many symbols of the flag, the red, everything there has a Christian framework, the holidays, the days of the week. Why shouldn't the Jewish people have the right to have their own self-determination, sovereign equality? That's how I would argue it. And then if I got into further details, I would look at Jewish history and certainly look at the Holocaust and the need to defend ourselves. Classical Zionism. Maybe that's not being taught anymore. Maybe it's not being accepted anymore.
One of the answers that I've often heard, and I've also heard this with the out of balance or kilter attention to Israel's wrongs, are, first of all, on the why a Jewish state. Well, there are lots of Muslim states, and why shouldn't there be one Jewish state? Would you think that's a viable answer?
Well, every country has its culture and its background, and that's why I started left Dafka with the Christian states, because it's not the standard answer. Because even when I go to Europe, Europeans are not used to having that. There's an established church in most of them, lots of ceremonies. So why shouldn't the Jewish people have the ability, I'd say it in a more positive way, the Jewish people, to survive, have to have a territory in which they are able to preserve their language, our culture, our history. The second part of that is what do you do with all the Arabs, and that's a strong issue of minority rights, which has to be the second part of the discussion. But if you deny the first, then you don't get to the second.
Todd?
Well, I don't disagree with that. I would add a couple of elements. First of all, part of what's so infuriating about the discourse, such as it is, about this, is that the claim is made that Israel is intrinsically a colonial state, when in fact it was an anti-colonial state. That is to say, it had to fight, obviously, against the British. So there's just rank ignorance at work here. But there's a second issue as well, and I think maybe you might say I'm a minimalist about this. You know, there are all kinds of states that exist with all kinds of histories, and by the way, there's not one of them that's not blood-soaked. And they have funny kinds of legitimacy. I mean, as we all know these days, Iraq and Syria were created by post-British and French agreements after World War I, which is why they have those nice regular borders. And Sykes-Picot Treaty is what I'm talking about. And so, I mean, it's sort of the notion that some states are holier because of their genesis than others, I find unnecessary, because the state of Israel was recognized. Leave aside the biblical, leave aside demographic, leave aside the history of the people. It was a state that was recognized as states are recognized duly in 1948. And so there it is. So, you know, okay, it happens to be not trying to parse. It's not easy to say what a Jewish state is, and that's also an interesting discussion now. But okay, this state happens to have this history, and so there it is. So
as India and Pakistan were recognized at the same time.
Indeed, very good. So in the spirit of realism. So okay, and by the way, I don't bite my tongue about what I think is awful about this, what the state of Israel is doing, but. You know, the United States has committed, you know, I spent much of my life fighting against American war crimes. It never occurred to me that the United States should not be permitted to exist. Never, not once. Show me the nation that has not, you know, a bloody birth, and I'll show you a fantasy. I'm not saying, by the way, I've signed on to the whole, I'm not talking about what actually happened in 1948. I'm talking about the logic of states. They have checkered histories. They're often displacing people. I mean, we're in the island of Manhattan, people. Okay, do we know something about displacement? If somebody came to argue, somebody, you know, that they were descended from the people who lived here in the 17th century, and that we've been trespassers all these years, I can see their case. I mean, they're not making it up. You might want to argue, you know, how much money and so on and so on. But look, let's face it. You know, history has a statute of limitations on, and you know, when you start tossing out states, you know, Europe gives us, I think, a very vivid history of what happens when certain states decide that other states are illegitimate. I mean, that's a recipe for nonstop warfare.
You know, I think what the answer that you're giving is a much better answer than when some people say, well, why all this attention to Israel? Why not North Korea? Why not Sudan? You know, and other abusers of countries that have abused human rights or accused and have abused human rights. And I say I hate that argument, because that's not what Israel wants to be compared to. But if you start talking about the origins of the United States, if you start talking about India and Pakistan, I think it's a much stronger.
Show me a state that doesn't have, you know, an imperial bloody history.
But there is a more complicated element which gets us back to some of the issues that we're talking about, and that is, first of all, that the United States, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia, the issue of having a heterogeneous population, there's no, at least in theory, no dominant group, there's no a dominant religious group or linguistic group. And these countries, after they wiped out their indigenous populations, exist primarily in order to promote these values of pluralism and equality. That's not the same thing as Europe, for instance, or other countries. Most other countries in the world do have a core, a dominant cultural and or religious and ethnic and linguistic core.
Okay.
France is France, and you cannot not be France, and that gets to the issue of wearing the hijab and other things. So when Israel's singled out on, that's what I try to get students to understand, that why are you asking that question about Israel and not 190 other countries? And usually they just don't have that vision, that understanding that, in fact, most countries are ethno-national religious cores, or have from which they spring. Mm-hmm. And growing up in America tends to erase those core parts of it. I think it's easier to understand Israel, Dafka, if you're from Europe than if you're from the United States. And how do you get that to students?
Here's a question which is the heart of much of what we were talking about, posed to both of you. Can we agree that BDS, anti-Zionism in the form of BDS, is a form of anti-Semitism?
I don't agree, although there's certainly an overlap. The question of what exactly is anti-Semitism, you know a great deal more about than I mean, that seems to me like a rabbit hole that distracts us from a particular set of problems. There are, I know anti-Zionists who I do not think are anti-Semitic, and I have no doubt that there are BDS supporters who are anti-Semitic. I don't think that's the right ground on which to fight. Okay. That is to say, because to me, for reasons that I was just saying, the legitimacy of the State of Israel is a matter of international law. And I don't particularly care why somebody thinks the State of Israel should be abolished. I don't think it's I don't think it's legitimate. I don't see why. So there, the argument that Israel is unfairly singled out, I think, is correct. But there are plenty of arguments one might have about the legitimacy of this or that state. Certainly, one might well say that about Syria. And I would say, by the way, I do want to add, as much as I do believe that the Palestinians are a colonized people on the West Bank. So I hope that doesn't rule out what I'm about to say. I do think that that's stipulated. The obsession with Israel, which Gerald talks about, is also an obscenity. I mean, this is a world of suffering. It's a world of oppression. We don't need to be reminded about that in the age of Syria. And I don't want to use Syria or any other abominable state as a sort of all-purpose alibi for Israel. I mean, to me, if the State of Israel is a better place to live than Syria, it's a low bar. I mean, I don't think anybody who wants the State of Israel to thrive should be satisfied and say, well, it's we used to hear the same thing about Saddam Hussein, sort of, we're better than Saddam Hussein. No, Israel makes a claim. It makes a claim because it's the state of the Jewish people, because it has a place in relation to liberal traditions, which is in the process of transgressing, which we should care about. That's what I grew up to think was Jewish. But I don't think that, but that said, I do think it's fair to say to somebody, isn't there anything else in the world you think about besides this or that abomination committed by the State of Israel? I probably, I think about a lot of subjects. I write about a lot of subjects. I probably spend disproportionate, if we talk about world population or something, I sort of probably devote myself more to matters in the State of Israel than anywhere else besides the United States. And I don't, for me, it's a matter of values, and I'm unapologetic about it. But the degree, I'm also capable of noticing what's going on next door. Mm-hmm. And if you're not capable of noticing what's going on in Syria, or in Iraq, or in Saudi Arabia, or so on, I don't think you're intellectually serious.
Mm-hmm.
I want the issue of anti-Semitism. I want to talk about it in the context, particularly of the D. It's boycotts, divestments, and sanctions. And most divestments are church-based. That tends to be the language that's used. And there, in many cases, it is classical anti-Semitism mixed with anti-Zionism.
Could you say more about what you mean by that?
Well, when you have the resolutions backed by and sometimes containing the language of a supersessionism that God has rejected the Jewish people for all of their sins, and you have Christianity finding Christ. That is the...
There are such resolutions?
Yes, there are. The head of one of the main figures in the Anglican Church that's promoting divestment, or BDS, is a gentleman by the name of Reverend Stephen Sizer, and he's written books, theological tracts, and he is part of the British Anglican establishment. He's not some guy and he was actually censored for having explicitly made anti-Semitic comments, and he I think he had to give up his Twitter account for 6 months or something like that. But the point is, there is if you look, you can look, I'm not making this stuff up, folks, it's too depressing to make up. If you look at groups like Sabeel, which are very active, there's a guy from Sabeel, Naim Matik, who talks about it, and he goes from church to church.
What does that mean, Sabeel?
Sabeel is, I think, it's something to do with justice in Arabic. It's not, but the group calls itself Sabeel, and it's based in Jerusalem.
Right.
And it's the Anglican, a former Anglican bishop by the name of Naim Matik, and he talks about things like Israel is the daily incarnation of the killing of Christ. The language which is clearly theological, or when you have, I can go on and on for that, so I won't go on. But there, I think that's a serious issue, and I think it needs to be addressed. And again, I think that's something that I have these conversations with Jewish leaders who are involved in ecumenicalism, that this is something that I think we should be, the Jewish community should be more, I guess I'll use the term aggressive, more visible.
I don't have any trouble condemning. I mean, that sounds like raw anti-Semitism. I mean, the whole supersessionist argument is sort of a foundation. Well, no, then it's. I haven't heard it here. I mean, it should be excoriated wherever it crops up.
I'll let you know when there's another tour, because they do.
Well, I'm interested. I just have heard no such thing.
This is a question for you, Todd. But you're welcome to weigh in as well. Have you seen all the uproar on BDS on college campuses make it harder for progressive Zionists who are against the occupation of the West Bank and to voice their opinions for fears of being called anti-Zionist or for giving fuel to the enemy, etc.?
That's a good question, and I don't know what my answer is. I do think that it is appropriate for students, let's just call them the Jewish left or the Zionist left, to talk about measures which are not BDS, but are perhaps qualified by your terminology as BDS light. I don't have any qualms about boycotting products from the West Bank. I advocate that, but and I'm for labeling them. But is it the case factually that somebody who's a liberal Zionist feels that they're sort of tainted by BDS? I just don't know. I'd be interested to know.
And students who were on campus, on general campus, I know some rabbinical students and other students there. Any of them want to weigh in answering that?
Becca's got it.
Rebecca. Rebecca, stand up.
Hi, I'm a grad student at Columbia. I'm getting my Ph.D. in political science. I actually think the Jewish left shines when it comes to BDS. I have a lot of issues with some of the organizations that you might put in the Jewish left, but if it's like a J Street organization, they don't support BDS, so they're different than Jewish Voice for Peace. And actually on a liberal campus like Columbia, they're able to gather a lot of support that the pro-Israel student groups we can't reach those left-wing students. And so I actually think they have a key role to play when it comes to BDS.
I think what you're hearing something very important, because so often I hear, whether it's over Kiddush at whatever synagogue of whatever stripe I'm at, and I go to all of them, and as the late Harold Schulweis said, you have to be ashamed of all of them. It doesn't matter what movement you're part of, just be ashamed of it. But people talking about specifically J Street with almost a sneer, as if, Is he J Street? Are they J Street? Is J Street there? And what Rebecca, who's been very active in this and has worked with Gerald, I think, in his organization, so she's all over the place in terms of, and
Very consistent.
Okay, whatever. We're glad you're here. But you hear what she's saying? She is saying that J Street, the students who are affiliated with J Street have a better access and are heard, not listened to, but heard by students on the left who might be pro-BDS because they've got street cred in the credibility amongst on the left. So instead of, condemn, oh my God, which you hear so often, I think illegitimately so, but you hear it so often, say, wait a minute, these may be our most important advocates because they're seen by these groups who are so opposed to Israel as having this credibility. Am I? Okay.
And I will say, you might disagree with J Street on a lot of issues, like I do myself, but when it comes to BDS, it's like they do just reach a different audience than the pro-Israel groups.
Thank you. Anyone else here want to? Okay. Gerald, is the BDS movement really an organized Cold War against Israel? Is it a vestige of the Cold War in a new form?
I'm not sure I would use the term the vestige. It's got its own dynamics. It's a vestige of 1948 or the 1920s. It's a vestige of rejectionism, that Israel does not have the right to exist like all other nations. And it's being used a lot to propel that message, but messages are different in different places. And I think we go back to the original point that there is no core leadership. That's a difference. The Cold War, you had the Soviet Union, you had a government that ran things. BDS has got this amorphous process, and different aspects of it push different agendas at different times. Makes it much harder to grasp. But the concept of it being a war, I think that has its, in looking at the need to bring in as many different perspectives and try to focus them on different aspects of BDS, if we look at it as a war, I think that makes it easier to say, yes, we've got to get the resources, we've got to come up with a strategy. The strategy has to make sense. One of the things we left out, we didn't talk about, was when do you give oxygen when you shouldn't be? Mm-hmm. And that's actually a way to section into that. In a war, or certainly in a political war like a Cold War, you need to be able to decide where do you invest your resources, what challenges do you take on, which are the ones that serve your interests, and which ones are ones that you should let go, because otherwise you make them much greater than they otherwise would be. And I think that's something that needs to be sorted out. I will certainly blame my own government for very often mountain into molehill type of things. I won't go through some examples, but making something a headline story that otherwise would have just basically passed through. Mm-hmm. Not everything is like that. And I go back to the issues that I think are important, the church divestment and other examples. Not so much maybe the campus student divestment activities, but more the professional associations. And other people have different perspectives on that. So the analogy, I think, of a Cold War in that sense is a good one, where you have to be careful not to do things which actually make the other side empower them and give them greater successes.
Mm-hmm. I would just add that the disgrace of these academic associations is so titanic. We're talking about academic associations that maintain fraternal relations with universities in name 80 countries, name
China.
100. China,
I
to start with. China's right.
Somebody says to me, we're boycotting Israel. I say, are you boycotting China because it's Tibet? And you're going to give up your television and your trips to Shanghai? No.
This does not pass the laugh test, and it deserves nothing but scorn.
Ridicule.
But it's out there.
But those are the kind of answers you need.
My impression
more than declaring them anti-Semites.
Yeah, I don't care if they're anti-Semites. Right. They're sort of I would say they're unprofessional. Mm-hmm. My impression, Deborah, you may know more than I, is that there's a lot more of this in Britain than there is here.
Yeah.
It's been going on for years in Britain.
The
refusal,
in Britain, yes.
and even cases of academic journals that refused to accept submissions from Israelis. I mean,
One of
this-
my colleagues
This
said
is
exactly
disgusting.
that.
This is completely
Or people who will
disgusting.
say it wasn't so much that will accept an Israeli who comes with independent funding. And
Yeah,
not
yeah,
that-
yeah, right.
It's that if this Israeli comes and they declare that they are against the policies of their government,
Right.
then
Oh, yeah,
they,
right.
and do you ask that of the Chinese scholar? Do you ask that of the Myanmar, whatever it might be, et cetera?
By the way, any Chinese scholar who is willing to do that, would not have a return ticket
Right,
home.
exactly. Or if not if they enjoyed longevity, especially their own. Okay, this is the last question. Because where's my? Yes, okay. My boss.
The gong.
Hook, Well, people have tried that in the past, and it hasn't worked too well for them. So, I am a Columbia undergraduate. You didn't identify yourself. And recently, the campaign titled "Columbia University Apartheid Divest" has launched, and there will be a bill in the student government on BDS. Many professors and deans have signed on to a petition in support of the BDS. Furthermore, on the professor review site, there are many reviews warning pro-Israel students not to take certain Middle Eastern study classes, as they will be defamed by their professors. How do you respond to this climate and debate on Columbia's campus?
Can I just make one intro and then, because I think there's something missing in this which I don't understand. Where's the student? Are you willing to identify yourself? I thought that something like 65, and I think you were one of them, right? Faculty members just signed an anti-BDS.
No, there's a different statement,
that's
which I
too
did
high,
not
okay.
sign, but it has many more signatures. The anti-BDS
And
statement.
there's a new organization of faculty members that is, what's his name, Udoff and...
Yeah,
Ken
Ken Walter.
Walter.
I'm involved with that,
Okay.
Yeah.
So there is a pushback. So that's not part of your
Well,
equation?
My understanding is that
Got
the pro-BDS statement from the faculty got something like 70 signatures. The statement that came out of the law school, I think already over 200 opposing BDS. I think that 70 tells you, I don't know how many faculty members there are at Columbia, I mean, many thousands. There's a core of people who hate Israel, okay? I mean, we understand that. But I don't, I really very much doubt, I see no sign, at least in the sort of scuttlebutt that I'm privy to, that they're gaining any traction. I mean, they're not making more friends. Everybody knows what they think, and I don't think they're insurgent. I mean, I saw that demonstration, the wall and so on. I mean, if it comes to the point, and this actually speaks to the question about how much attention should one pay to these things. If it comes to the point where some of these groups are putting forward BDS resolutions before student governments and so on, they should be opposed. I mean, that's straightforward. The challenge is there. You have to defeat them. I'm not sure BDS has actually won any referendum anywhere. I may be mistaken about that. But they keep getting rebuffed. So, I mean, it's not...
In England, they've won.
No, I mean in the U.S. Or Canada, for that matter. But I do think, it's important to push back. And when students, and this I feel very strongly about, as a matter of academic freedom, if there are students who are being penalized, not that they're afraid of being penalized, because sometimes we have to speak up for views which we are nervous about expressing, and we grow in the process of defending those views. But if somebody is actually being trashed by a teacher or made to feel humiliated or threatened, that is a grave violation of academic propriety. And
Academic freedom, the freedom of the student.
Absolutely, and complaints should be filed. I mean, that is straight out verboten.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I want to maybe end. I know we have a number of rabbis and rabbinical students in the room, but and I'm just a lowly professor when it comes to that. I don't get parsonage or anything, I just want to put this in a little bit of a context of first of all, I want to thank our two panelists
and our chair.
Thank you, and I want I want to take up a collection to get Professor Steinberg better
Better socks,
socks.
yeah.
You know, he did not get the memo, but Professor Gitlin obviously did. Clearly anti-Israel, right? Right. We will sock it to you.
I was going to say there's a sock washing.
Yes,
but
right. We're on the eve of Pesach. For those of you who aren't cleaning, those who are cleaning, you know it well. And maybe it's a time just to say we've spent this evening, I think, in a very productive conversation, and one of the best conversations I've heard since this whole thing has begun within the Jewish community in a very affirmative way, by two people who have very differing views, but the ability to converse is something that we should take away from this. But we've also spent the evening talking about the Jew as object, Israel as object. And we have to talk about that because many things are done to Jews and have been done to Jews, et cetera, and I spend my life studying what has been done to Jews. But maybe in the anticipation of Pesach to also remember Jewish subject and what Jews do, and not to be, as Professor Salo Baron, who held the first chair in Jewish history in the United States, longtime professor and dean of Jewish history in the United States at Columbia University, reminded us not to succumb to the lachrymose, the tearful theory of Jewish history, that we have much more about which to rejoice and to celebrate than to mourn, even as we are on guard for attacks, not to let that become the raison d'etre or the prism through which we see our Jewish identity. So on that affirmative note, I thank you all, and I wish you a good night.
L'shana haba b'Yerushalayim habnuya.
Earlier.